Hello again and welcome to another Mordian Glory Warhammer 40k video. In today's episode, we are going to be doing a tournament after action report. That's right, it's time for some more dispatches from the front lines. And oh boy, do I have a spicy meatball for your viewing pleasure today. And I'm not just saying that. Look, I know I say spicy meatball at the beginning of a lot of these after action reports, but truly, this may be the peak of my meme tournament report list journey. The peak of my career. Because I finally did it. I finally took triple Deathstrikes to a tournament. And let me tell you, it wasn't as bad as you might think. I expected to go and lose every game at this tournament. But fate, or perhaps the Emperor, had a different plan in mind. And so, with that foreshadowing hanging in the air, let us not mess around any further. Let us turn our keys at the same time, press the big red button, and tactically nuke our way right into today's episode. As is tradition, I want to start off by saying a few thank yous. Firstly, I want to say a big thank you to the hosts and tournament organisers for this event, Just Play. Just Play is a familiar name on these tournament reports because I tend to go to pretty much all of their events. And there's a good reason for that. They're really well run, the store is well organised, the staff are really on top of things, and overall the events are just fun to go to. The community there is an absolute blast as well, with all of the players just being a ton of fun to play against, and I've made many friends by going to these tournaments at Just Play. Speaking of the players, of course, I want to say a massive thank you to all of my opponents. As per usual, I had 3 fantastic games, and the main reason for that was the people that I played against. So massive thank you to all of my opponents. It was another fantastic Just Play event, and you guys were the reason for that. But with all of that said, let's not mess around any further. Let's get into the video proper, starting off with the list overview. As usual, I have recorded a separate army list video, really deep diving the whole thing and getting into the nitty-gritty details. I'll make sure that there's a link to that video down in the description below. But just to give you guys a quick summary, essentially this list was an adaptation of my classic mechanized guard army, but I swapped out some of my artillery for Deathstrikes. So I had 2 tank commanders, both with Demartia cannons, las cannons, and plasma cannons. And of course, I had the heavy stubbers and the hunter killer missiles. I then had 5 chimeras, each with 10 Catachans inside, giving me lots of scouting potential. And I also had 3 Leman Russ Vanquishers. I love Vanquishers now. They are my favorite Leman Russ variant. The amount of anti-tank they can throw down the board is amazing. Every single one of the chimeras was equipped with double heavy flamer, heavy stubber, and hunter killer missile, and every single one of the vanquishers had las cannons, plasma cannons, heavy stubbers, and hunter killer missiles. I also had 5 scions and a commissar that went into reserve every game just to do secondary objectives. And of course, finally, I had the triple Deathstrike. The idea behind this list is that it has still got plenty of mechanized infantry to be able to do primary game and to help bulk out my tank fleet, because you can't really ignore a chimera that's driving around, hitting you with potentially 4 flamers a turn if you include the firing deck. And I also had lots of direct firepower with the Leman Russes and secondary game with the scions and with the commissar. Essentially, the Deathstrikes were just taking the role of my indirect fire in what was otherwise a very balanced guard army. And I specifically chose an army like this. When I was putting the army list together, I did think about going full bore meme mode and going full Krieg and having like a unit of Death Riders and one of each Malkador variant and all this kind of stuff, but it ended up just looking like a collection of random units, and there wasn't much theming to it, and it wasn't even that memey. It just looked a bit random and crappy, to be honest. So instead, the theme I went for the army was everything is mechanized, because if we're launching a bunch of nuclear missiles around, we're going to need to have tanks and stuff to cross the irradiated wasteland. On top of that, this list actually has some power behind it. It's got some pedigree behind it, because I have used similar lists to this to great effect at multiple tournaments. And really the idea was, I'm going to take an army which I know is fundamentally powerful, and hopefully it'll be powerful enough to offset what is essentially 420 point nerf to my army with those 3 Deathstrikes. Long story short, I'm taking a good list that's going to try and carry the dead weight of the Deathstrikes. But as it turned out, the Deathstrikes weren't all that dead weight. Ooh, I know, I'm blue balling you, I'm edging you guys a little bit. But before I get into the games, let's take a look at the lay of the land. So what was this event all about? What was the format and how competitive was it? Well, in terms of the format, it was a classic quintessential RTT experience. There were 3 rounds that were played over 1 day, and there were about 2 hours and 45 minutes per round. Now, the terrain was not player placed, it was set up using terrain maps. However, we didn't use anything like UKTC or WTC or GW terrain maps. Rather, Just Play has a whole bunch of their own in-house terrain that they use, and they have developed some pretty effective terrain maps to utilize the resources that they have available. As for the terrain, it's not player placed. Just Play uses pre-placed terrain and terrain maps to make sure that all of the scenery is balanced and fair across the board. However, they don't use anything like UKTC, WTC or GW terrain maps. Rather, they have developed a whole bunch of in-house terrain so they can use what assets they have available. Now, these terrain maps have been developed by experienced players. They've not just been thrown together, and they are based on good tournament play, and they do result in pretty fair and balanced matchups. The one thing I would say about Just Play terrain is that it slightly favors shooting armies. Assault armies absolutely can still do a lot of work on these boards, and there are a number of World Eater players that tear it up at Just Play, don't get me wrong, but you will find that there are adequate firing lanes if you are bringing a shooting army. But there's plenty of terrain in every deployment zone to make sure you can hide those high value assets, as it should be in a hyper lethal game like 40k, and there's plenty of terrain in the mid board so that you can hop from cover to cover, do staging, and still launch your assaults if you are an assault army. As for the competitiveness of this event, overall I would describe it as competitive. It's not a Shark Tank, but it's not a seal clubbing holiday either. There were about 20 players at this event, pretty normal size for an RTT, and all the players there were experienced. I recognized everyone around the hall, and everyone had been to at least one tournament before, and many of the people that were playing were experienced with the Just Play tournaments themselves. And that is an important factor to take into account, because if you've got good knowledge of the local meta, and you've got good knowledge of what the terrain is going to be like, you can of course tweak your lists and get a little bit of extra efficiency out of them. So there was a lot of experience to be thrown around, and there were a lot of good lists that were being used as well. And I didn't see anyone who hadn't been to a tournament before. But with all of that said, that covers the pre-games preamble, the preamble if you will. Let's get to the real reason why you are all here, and let's take a look at the games. So my round 1 was against James and his Eldar. James is someone who I've actually played against before I Just Play, but last time we drew swords, it was in an Old World tournament where he was running his High Elves. Now today in James' army, he had an Autarch Wayleaper, he also had the Avatar of Cain, a Farseer Skyrunner, and a Warlock Skyrunner. In the battle line, there were 5 Corsair Void Reavers, and then in the other data sheets, there were 2 Fire Prisms and a Night Spinner, a unit of Rangers, a unit of Shroud Runners, a Warlock Conclave, 2 units of 5 warp spiders, and a unit of 9 wind riders. That's the Eldar jet bikes. This army was fast as all hell, and it had the firepower to back it up, especially with those fire prisms being premier tank killers. Now, the mission for round 1 was Burden of Trust, and this was combined with raised banners, and the deployment was Sweeping Engagement. Now, speaking of deployment, I heavily overloaded the left flank and the middle, whilst only putting a little bit on the right flank. Over on that right flank, the only thing that was there was a single Chimera with, catch on the side. I just wanted something that could potentially sneak out and get an objective if need be, and take advantage of the ruin that was on there as well. In the middle, I had 2 Chimeras, 2 Vanquishers, and the Tank Commander with Grand Strategist. And then over on the left, I had 2 Scout Mirrors, a Vanquisher, and the other Tank Commander. Finally, sitting on my home objective, I had the 3 Deathstrike missiles. As for the Eldar deployment, they were fairly regularly spaced out across the board. Over on the right, we had a Night Spinner and the Fire Prism. In the middle, we had the other Fire Prism, the bikes, and the Conclave. Over on the left, we had the small unit of Ranger bikers. Speaking of Rangers, there was 1 unit that infiltrated into no man's land on the right flank, and there were a unit of Warp Spiders that was on each flank as well, ready to zoom out and start doing objectives. With everything deployed, it was time to roll off to see who was going to get the first turn, and Skinwalker Mordian was in command this battle, as I did manage to win that roll off. Going first didn't give me too many advantages in terms of being able to do damage, but there were a couple of interesting opportunities that did occur. Firstly, by getting first turn, it meant I could aggressively scout move pretty much all of my Chimeras forward, because I knew I wasn't going to just scout move forward and then lose them all into my opponent's turn 1. So I pushed 2 Chimeras as far as I could down the left flank, and I also pushed 1 of my Chimeras in the mid onto the middle objective, just trying to lock some of that stuff down. I also took my Chimera on the right flank, and between the scout move and the move, I was able to get it onto the objective on the right hand side and wholly within the terrain, so I could then see the Rangers. For shooting, the only real targets that I had was I was able to pick up all of the Eldar Rangers with the Hellhound that got into the terrain with them, just burn them all to death. And I was able to put a Vanquisher into the Eldar Ranger jet bikes, and I killed 2 of them and put 1 on 1 wound. But most significantly, I took all 3 of my Deathstrikes and I put all 3 of their Deathstrike markers onto my opponent's home objective. This caused him to be in a bit of a dilemma, a bit of a pickle, because he wanted to take his Autarch and leave it on the home objective, just guarding it and getting a whole bunch of primary points whilst the rest of his army pushed forward. But if he does that, I'm just going to trigger one of the nukes and, in theory, easily pick up that Autarch. So it meant that my opponent wasn't really able to defend his home objective, and if he wanted to score any primary, he was going to have to come out and play. But I've got a lot more tanks than him, and if he pushes out too aggressively, he could hit the guard hard, but then he's going to get hit back even harder. So Eldar turn 1 comes around, and James starts using his mobility to his advantage, but he's playing it kind of cagey. He doesn't want his fragile Eldar tanks to get into a slugging match with 5 Leman Russes, and he won't be able to draw a line of sight to any of my tanks. So if I get that first blow, it could be really, really difficult. He wants to get the first hammering shots into my vehicles. As a result, what happens is all of the jet bikes that were in the mid go over to the left flank, and all of the vehicles, the fire prisms and the night spinner, come over to the right flank. The Avatar of Cain goes right down the middle. Big distraction Carnifex unit, and it has on it -1 to wound from the Farseer, because it can get, I think it's Fortune, and this makes this thing unbelievably difficult to kill. As for the Eldar shooting, they are able to completely evaporate a Chimera over on the right flank, the one that had burned the Rangers out, and in the middle, the Chimera that had gone on to the middle objective is nuked by the Avatar. But I was able to force the Avatar to consolidate into the infantry squad, and as a result, he did kind of get left exposed, potentially facing down a lot of my firepower. As for other minor Eldar movement, one of the unit of warp spiders teleported over to the right flank. That's the one where my Chimera died and the infantry got out to the objective. And then the remaining Eldar sniper jet bike, the Ranger one, just went and hid behind the ruin in the middle of their deployment zone. Battle round 2 quickly comes around, and I draw for my objectives Bring It Down and Overwhelming Force. And that was actually a set of really bad objectives because the Eldar weren't actually on any of the objectives. So as a result, I couldn't get Overwhelming Force. Obviously, it's good for me on primary, it's bad for me on secondary. Furthermore, when I spent my CP to get rid of Overwhelming Force and redraw a card using new orders, I got marked for death. So that, I mean, I just bin marked for death off at the end, but essentially I spent my turn without any good secondaries on that front, because the only other secondary that I had was Bring It Down. And the only target I could get for Bring It Down was the Avatar of Cain. Now, in hindsight, I should have completely ignored the Avatar, because I could easily have slung all of my damage into the Eldar jetbike unit, which is like 11 strong, thanks to the fact that there's a Warlock in there and a Farseer in there and 9 jetbikes, something insane. But I kind of got tunnel visioned and I went for the Avatar. But the moment that I targeted it, my opponent went lightning fast reflexes. So now we have an Avatar who's -1 to hit and -1 to wound and is halving all incoming damage, and on a 2-up, 4-up, and has an Eldar reroll and has fate dice involved, and there's a Farseer nearby that can help with some of those armor save shenanigans as well. So my turn 2. I do great on primary, by the way. I'm sat on 2 objectives, and I'm guarding those objectives as well. I do really well on the primary. There's no issues there. The problem is when I try and kill the Avatar, and I put 3 Vanquishers into it, I put 2 Demolishers into it, and I fire every hunter killer missile I can. I mean, overall, this thing got hit by 3 Vanquisher cannons, 5 las cannons, 10 plasma cannons, 5 heavy stubbers, 5 hunter killer missiles. And it lives on 3 wounds. Now, a big part of why it lived is because my Vanquishers were hitting and they were wounding. But the first one, James just stopped on a 4+. And then the second one, he failed, but he CP rerolled it and passed. And then the third one, he just auto passed it. There's a fate dice shenanigan where essentially you can sub a fate dice in for a save, but the Farseer can like turn it to, I think, a result that you want. Or maybe he had a fate dice in the bank, I'm not sure. But either way, this thing passed all of the big Vanquisher shots. And so then it came down to me trying to kill it with Demolish cans, which are kind of swingy. I rolled kind of poorly on some of my damage rolls. And it just ended up living on 3 wounds, which was huge because it basically meant in my turn 2, I had not taken out any enemy assets and I had not scored any secondaries. And the only thing I'd been able to do is score well on primary. And now my opponent, and I've come out and exposed myself, and now my opponent is going to be able to hit me back pretty hard, and I could take some pretty bad damage here. And in Eldar turn 2, that's exactly what they do. They punish me for my arrogance in thinking I could kill their god of war. Over on the right flank, I lose the infantry squad that I piled out of the Chimera. And then in the middle, I also lose all but one of the infantry squad guys that had been tying up and move blocking the Avatar. Over on the left flank, I lose 2 Chimeras, and I actually lose the infantry squad that piles out of one of those Chimeras as well. And that was thanks to the bikes and the Avatar just unleashing hell. A lot of those weapons are damaged too. There's like guide going off. It's crazy times. And I actually also unfortunately lose one of my tank commanders as well. because the fire prisms were able to do a long bomb shot over onto my Leman Ruster Marsh tank commander that had been on the left flank but had come over to the mid to try and help deal with the Avatar. And so in my turn 2, I killed nothing of the Eldar army. And in their turn 2, they pick up essentially 3 infantry squads, 2 chimeras, and a demolisher tank commander. Going into round 3, and the only thing that is keeping me in this game is the fact that the Eldar are not in a good position to really score any primary points, and they have been struggling on their secondary game as well, having only picked up 6 secondary points over the first 2 battle rounds. Going into my turn 3, and I draw my secondaries, and I get no prisoners and assassination. Over the last 2 turns, I have just drawn kill thing cards, which is quite difficult against Eldar sometimes. They're surprisingly drawable with a lot of the shenanigans they can pull out. But fortunately, this time, the Avatar is only on 3 wounds, and I still have a number of assets available to try and bring him down. And that's exactly what I do. I have 1 more Chimera over on that left flank with a unit of infantry inside. And what I do is I pile that infantry out and I spend my CP to throw grenades at the Avatar. I'm able to do 2 wounds to the Avatar. I just need to do 1 more. But fortunately, between the Chimera and the infantry squad, I'm able to just chip off that last wound. Even with CP rerolls being used, I am able to chip it off. And I believe it's actually the mighty heavy stubber on the Chimera, which finally brings the Avatar down. Get on that 50! Someone get on that 50! Unfortunately, because it had taken more than expected to kill the Avatar, it meant that I didn't have as much ready to go into the bikers. And I only had 2 Lemurous Vanquishers. Now, Vanquishers are really good vehicles, but they definitely drop off a little bit when you start encountering large units. And I fired both Vanquishers into the bikes, and one of my Vanquishers had to move rather than take aim so it could draw line of sight. And so by the time all was said and done, there was still a couple of the bikes left. I believe there was the 2 characters. So I got rid of all the bikers, but the Farseer and the Warlock were left completely untouched. The last thing I was able to do in my turn 3 was bring my Leman Vanquisher that had been hanging around at the back over to the right hand side, the middle right. And I was able to draw line of sight onto one of the fire prisms and also onto the warp spiders. And fortunately, I was able to kill the warp spiders, and I took 9 wounds off the fire prism as well. Oh, it was a lot of wounds. I'm not sure how many they start with, but it had 2 wounds by the time I was done. I was also able to deep strike down my unit of Scions and bring my Commissarian over on that flank, and those 2 units also helped mop up things like the warp spiders and do some damage to the fire prism. And just like that, we go into Eldar turn 3, and suddenly the amount of assets that they have available has just kind of fallen. The bikers are dead. One of these warp spiders is dead. The rangers are dead. The Corsairs have been picked up along the way. I don't even know by what. The ranger bikers are down to 1 wound. And all they really have left at this point is a couple of characters on jet bike and 3 tanks. One of which is very badly injured. And it really struck me at that point. That is where the fragility of the Eldar comes in now. They're a phenomenally powerful army, and we saw what kind of damage they can do. But their fragility doesn't come down to the individual units. It comes down to if you just kick a few legs out from underneath them, they just fall over. They just run out of cheap assets very quickly. And so the Eldar turn 3, it was a good one, but they're still not on any primary objectives. And they drew containment as one of their secondaries, which forces 2 of their remaining assets left over to get some points. And then they got overwhelming force, which is easy for them to pick up. They're able to destroy a couple of my scraplet units that were hanging out on objectives. But that was kind of it for the Eldar turn. They picked up a few scraplets and they got containment. And so going into the latter part of the game, turn 4 and turn 5, The guard kind of overwhelmed the Eldar just through sheer numbers. And we're not just talking numbers of infantry here, we're talking numbers of vehicles. And I started getting pretty big bollocks with my tanks because I know that the Eldar are going to come out, maybe kill one of them, but then in return, I can pick up one of their tanks. And in a 1-for-1 trade, the guard are going to come out on top of that equation every single time. So over the course of my turn 4, what happens is I'm able to pick up the final unit of warp spiders, and interestingly I actually do that with the Deathstrikes because the warp spiders had boosted really far forward to get behind enemy lines, and so I just used the 3 heavy bolters and the 3 hunter killer missiles from the Deathstrikes to pick up those warp spiders, and then I'm able to finish off the injured fire prism fairly easily with one of my vanquishers, and I end up picking up a whole bunch of other small scraplet units as well over turn 4, turn 5. But the big thing that happens is turn 5, I'm finally able to launch one of my Deathstrikes, and I've been moving the tokens around, kind of using them as primary denial, because the units that my opponent has left are ones that do not want to get hit by a Deathstrike. Like, if you put a lone Farseer onto objective, I'm gonna unleash that Deathstrike. If you put that 1 wound Ranger biker onto objective that I put a mark on, I'm gonna unleash that Deathstrike. And so the Deathstrikes weren't really doing much apart from just constantly denying 2 to 3 primary objectives from my opponents and just move the tokens around. I moved them around preemptively, being like, I think you're going to go for this objective next, so I'm going to put a token on that just to try and deny it to you. And in turn 5, I finally got to launch one of my Deathstrikes onto the enemy's home objective, where they'd put an Autarch to guard it, and I nuked him. Completely nuked him off the board. I got like 10 shots on the Deathstrike and just flattened an Autarch. So the kill count of the Deathstrikes game 1 was just an Autarch, but it was also, it wasn't the kills that were helping me. It was the fact that my opponent basically couldn't move on to a primary without losing whatever unit went on there, and him not getting those points anyway. So the Deathstrike's contribution to this game is not measured in kills. It was measured in really messing with my opponent's head and really messing with his plans for trying to get primary game. Of course, the Eldar weren't completely inactive in those last couple of turns, but due to rapidly running out of units and assets, their ability to score points was quite low. And by the time the dust had settled, all that was left over on the Eldar side was a Night Spinner and Fire Prism, and the Guard still had 3 Leman Russes, 2 Chimeras, 2 active Deathstrikes, and a couple of infantry squads. And the final score ended up being 42 points to the Eldar, but 69 points, nice, to his Imperial Guard. So with a surprise win under my belt, we go into round number 2, and this time we are taking on the Heretics, and I am playing Mark with his Chaos Space Marines. Now, Mark and I had actually played at another one of these 40k tournaments, but last time I had a very different army. I was running my 240 Tyrannid Bug Swarm, and Mark's army had killed hundreds, literally, of Tyrannids, but I had essentially won on the primary game, and I'd just been able to clog him up. This was going to be a very different battle. Mark's army had significantly evolved since the last time that we had played, and this time we were both bringing tanks. Lots of tanks. In the Chaos list, there was a Baron the Despoiler, a unit of 10 Cultists, and 2 units of Legionnaires. There was also a Chaos Land Raider, 2 Chaos Predator Destructors with the autocannon and the 2 las cannons, a squad of Chaos Terminators, just 5 strong, and then we had 2 Chaos Vindicators, a Hellbrute, and a big squad of 10 Warp Talon. All of this was being used inside the Renegade Raiders detachment, so it was going to be moving fast and hitting hard. So the mission that was going to witness this clash of steel was Scorched Earth. This was combined with the Stalwarts mission rule, which means battle line units can do actions and still shoot. And then this was all going to be taking place on Crucible of Battle deployment. Speaking of deployment, I went for an armored thrust on the left, an armored thrust on the right, and a little bit of mech in the middle. That means I had 2 scout mirrors on the left flank, supported by a tank commander and a vanquisher. I had a scout mirror, 2 vanquishers, and a tank commander with 2 orders on the right flank. And then in the middle, I had 2 scout mirrors, and I had my 3 Deathstrikes in a battery holding my home objective. As for the traitors deployment, Mark pretty much death blobbed everything on the left and in the mid. So over on the left, there was a Predator and a Vindicator. And then in the middle, we had the Land Raider, a Predator and a Vindicator. In the Land Raider was a Baden and Chums. And then there was the Cultists and the Hellbrute in the mid as well. The only thing that was on the right-hand flank was a unit of Legionnaires. And then there was another unit of Legionnaires that was ready to run over from the mid onto the right-hand flank as well. With our forces in place, it was time to find out who was going to seize the initiative, and regular Mordian was in command, as the Chaos Forces were able to go first. Powering up their warp-fueled engines, the Chaos Forces went for a fairly aggressive turn 1. The Predator and the Vindicator that were on the top left-hand flank moved down towards the mid. And they do that so they can draw line of sight and get into range of one of my chimeras. And this was important because they wanted to destroy that chimera so they could get a couple of points for Bring It Down, one of their secondaries. Everything else that was in that death ball behind that central ruin essentially moves down towards the bottom right, getting in position or staging themselves so that they'll be able to come round the corner and start blasting into the mid. It looks like both sides are going to be shoving a lot of armor into that mid board. Now the chaos shooting phase begins with the Vindicator firing everything into my chimera, but unfortunately, due to a combination of poor rolling from Mark and the fact that I had popped smoke, my chimera ends up surviving the volley from the Vindicator. The Predator then goes in and the las cannons just miss, so it's left up to the autocannon, but this thing's only AP -1, and so as a result, the chimera ends up surviving on 2 wounds. That was a really big problem for the Chaos Forces because it meant that they'd exposed a couple of assets to get some victory points and then not got those victory points. Coming over to guard turn 1, and I sense blood in the water. I sense an opportunity. Because if you look at these 2 armies, don't worry about the chimeras. Don't worry about the Deathstrikes. What is really going to determine victory here? It's the main battle tanks. And both sides have got 5 vehicles, which are good at killing the opposing vehicles. I've got 3 Vanquishers and 2 Demolishers. My opponent's got 2 Predators, 2 Vindicators, and a Land Raider. And whoever can gain the upper hand in this vehicle war will be able to leverage that and snowball it. Because right now it's 5v5. But if I'm able to take out even just one of those enemy vehicles, then it's going to become 5v4. And if I'm able to take out 2 of them, then it's going to become 3 versus 5. And that is going to give me a big lead in this armor battle. So with that in mind, I decide to have a very aggressive turn 1 myself. On the bottom right, I have a little convoy of 2 Vanquishers and a Demolisher, and I move those as far forward as possible so I can get line of sight onto the Vindicator and onto the Predator. And over on the left flank, I take my Demolisher and my Vanquisher and I move them more towards the middle left so that they can draw line of sight onto a Vindicator. My Chimeras all push forward fairly aggressively, and I put 2 of them on the top left objective, and I put 1 of them with an infantry squad that piles out onto the bottom right hand objective. And I got out because I wanted to do sabotage with the infantry squad, and I wanted to use the flames of the Chimera to go after a few stray Legionnaires. As for my Deathstrikes, I tried something a little different. At first I considered stacking all 3 on the enemy home objective again, but I figured there's just so much there between the Hellbrute and the Cultists and the Land Raider that whilst I might do damage, more than likely my opponent's just going to move away, and if he doesn't, then he'll just have enough on there to keep hold of his home objective. And instead I make a cordon sanitaire, and I essentially ring the middle objective and sort of top left flank with my Deathstrike tokens to make it so it's very unpalatable for my opponent to push any armor there, and rather forcing him to go down towards the right hand side. I don't mind if my opponent goes down towards the right hand side. I have plenty of tanks down there, and I'm able to then use my tanks that are in the middle left to then move out and ambush any vehicles that poke themselves around there. So I'm trying to sort of direct the flow of traffic with the Deathstrikes essentially. But then we get to the shooting phase proper, and it is brutal. Despite using CP rerolls and various stratagems, I have to say Mark's a little unlucky here. His dice are a little cool. And between all of my Leman Russes, I'm able to get both the Vindicator and the Predator that had been on that left flank. That was huge. That gave me a massive lead in this armor clash. I had expected to get one, not the other. Now, some of you might be wondering, Mordian, surely you would have expected to get both. That's a lot of firepower you're putting into them. Last time I faced a similar situation, I didn't kill a single Vindicator with this kind of firepower. They can be so tough with things like Armor of Contempt. And if you're just lucky and you got a CP reroll, but as it was, I was just able to get the shots on target that I needed, and I was able to get fairly lucky with my damage rolls, and this was compounded, like I said, by Mark rolling kind of cold. And so yeah, it took every bit of firepower that I had, but I did eliminate 2 out of 5 enemy vehicles, and I did take the lead in the Clash of Steel. The silver lining for the Chaos Forces is that pretty much every single one of my Leman Russes that fired their plasma cannons this turn rolled at least 1 on the hazardous check. And so I ended up doing, I think, 12 wounds across 5 tanks, because one of my tanks didn't overheat and the other 4 did. Which was, I actually did almost a full Leman Russes worth of wounds to myself. But I would happily take that trade every single day if it means that I'm able to take out completely 2 enemy vehicles. Round 2 for Chaos, and they bring their remaining Predator and Vindicator to the bottom flank, and they're able to see down the long vision corridor to one of my Leman Russes. They have the Land Raider, which comes round the mid and can draw line of sight to my Chimeras that are holding the objectives up there. They also drop down a big unit of Warp Talons, but they just put them in a safe position on that right flank. They're staging them. They're hiding behind that ruin. Next turn, they're going to jump out and cause me some problems. With all of their armor in position, the Chaos Forces prepare to unleash enough firepower to assault the gates of heaven themselves. But apparently, the Emperor's angels were watching over the guard this day, because all of that firepower just goes wide or bounces off. It was a terrible turn for the Chaos. The Land Raider unleashes into a Chimera. I don't even pop smoke. It misses 3 las cannons. And the 1 las cannon that goes through, it does a respectable amount of damage, but nothing much to write home about. And then the Predator and the Vindicator go into one of my Leman Russes, and they're able to bring it down to 7 wounds remaining. That was it. I did pop smoke on that Russ, to be fair. But that was it. That was the Chaos firepower. They just couldn't get those shots to connect. They just could not get that damage through. And that was a really bad turn for the Chaos. And we go into guard turn 2, and I punished them. I punished them hard. In my turn 2, I push forward on all fronts with all armored assets. And in my shooting, I pick up the remaining Predator and the remaining Vindicator. And I'm even able to do some damage to the Land Raider, bringing it down to just 8 wounds. And honestly, the game was probably over in that turn 2. That battle round 2. Because now I have pretty much got all of my tanks. A lot of them are very badly injured. Like I've got 1 on 7 wounds. The remaining ones are on like 10 wounds. I've got a Chimera on 2 wounds. I've got another Chimera on like half wounds. But I've taken a lot of damage. But my opponent's anti-tank now, ranged anti-tank, is a Land Raider. That's about it. Over turn 3 and turn 4, Chaos Forces do launch 2 final waves of attacks. Turn 3, the Warp Talons get a really big advance, and they've got a stratagem to advance and charge, and they go into one of my Leman Russes. But unfortunately, the only one they could actually get to was the full health one. And after all the slicing and dicing, it actually survives on 2 wounds. It passes its battle shock, it gets out of there, and the Warp Talons are left in front of a guard gun line. They all die, and then turn 4, Abaddon comes out into the middle objective, kills the Leman Russ that's on there, and then he gets picked up by all of my firepower. And over the course of turn 5, the guard tanks are just pushing forward on every front. The Land Raider goes down. I unleash 2 Deathstrikes onto the enemy home objective. I wipe out the cultists. It does take 2 of them, which is kind of funny, but I wipe out the cultists, and we get to the end of round 5, guys, and the only thing that the Chaos Forces have left on the board is a Hellbrute, and the only things that I have lost is 1 Leman Russ Vanquisher. That's it. Everything's damaged. I got Chimeras on 2 wounds. I got Leman Russes on like 3 wounds. I'm badly damaged, don't get me wrong. But very few of my armored units have actually been destroyed. And unfortunately, it is a bit of a crushing victory for the guard. For those of you that are curious, the kill count for the Deathstrikes this turn was 10 cultists. And I also was able to kill 2 Warp Talons, as I was able to just about nuke them with 1 of my Deathstrikes. And once the fallout from the nuclear bombs had dissipated, the final score was 40 points to Mark and 100 points to the Imperial Guard. We had a bit of a chat about the game, Mark and I, afterwards, and we both agreed that he was let down by his luck. He needed a few turns of just average dice rolling, and it just never seemed to materialize. Not taking out a Chimera with 2 big tanks, that's ridiculous. And then not taking out a Chimera which has got no smoke on it or anything with a Land Raider, it's just really summed up the game. But I would also say there was a mistake made by Mark. We did have a chat about this, so I'm not just like lambasting him online or anything like that. I think he was too aggressive early on. In fact, he said he thinks he might have been better playing it cagey. And I agree with that. I think even though there was bring it down points on the line, pushing out a Vindicator and a Predator to go for that 1 Chimera probably overexposed it. Push out 1 unit, and if you get it, great. And if you don't, you've not lost too much. But going for the double doozy really meant that if that didn't go off, it was a big blow. And even if it did go off, he's overexposed himself in this tank v tank battle. But hey, that's why we play games of Warhammer, so that we can learn and we can get better for the next event. Let's go into game number 3 now. And I don't mean to alarm you, gentlemen, but I'm now 2 victories under my belt, and I'm going into round 3 playing on table 1. In game number 3, I was going to be playing against Jack and his Votann. Now, Jack is someone who has actually popped up in a few of these tournament after action reports. He's normally the Chaos guy. You will have seen him stomp my ass with his World Eaters, and we've also got a pretty even match record against each other with his Death Guard. Sometimes he beats me, sometimes I beat him. But this time was going to be a very different game because he was running his beautiful red Votann army. In this list, we have a Brokey Ironmaster. We've also got an On-Here Champion, another On-Here Champion, and then we've got 10 Hearthkin Warriors. These were split into 2 5-man squads. There were 2 Sagittars, a big unit of Brokia Thunderkin, and then we have a unit of Berserkers, and then we've got the Hearthguard, another unit of Hearthguard. Both of these were 5 dwarf strong, and then not 1, not 2, but 3 Hekachonk land fortresses. Woo, baby! Basically, a triple land raid for Lids, guys. Absolutely insane. And there were a couple of the Hergin Pioneers as well, the Biker Dwarves from Mars. The mission for this game was supply drop. This was combined with adapt or die, and the deployment was search and destroy. Speaking of deployment, I had a scout mirror on the right flank, and I also had a tank commander hiding in a ruin on the right flank of my deployment zone. In the middle, covering that central firing lane, I had 2 Leman Russ Vanquishers. And I was kind of clever with my deployment because I pre-measured it and I made sure that no matter how far that Hekachonk moved, it was not going to be able to get into range of my Vanquishers if it came forward. This was one of the things that you learn to take advantage of with Votann. Their weapons are very, very short range. So weirdly, you could end up deploying quite out in the open and not really worrying about it because you know at best you might take a few pseudo heavy bolter shots. Also in the middle, I had 2 scout mirrors. Over on the left flank, I had a Vanquisher, a tank commander, and 2 more scout mirrors. And of course, hiding on my home objective and generally just being at the back of the whole battle, we had the 3 Deathstrikes. For the Votann deployment, on the right flank, they had a Hecaton and a unit of Bikers and a Sagitteur. And on the left flank, they had a unit of Bikers, a Hecaton, and a Sagitteur. The Sagitteur on the right flank had a unit of Hearthkid inside. The Sagitteur on the left flank had a unit of Berserkers inside. In reserve, there was an empty Hecaton, and also the big unit of exosuit guys, the Brokia Thunderkin. With all of our forces deployed, it was time to find out who was going to get that first turn, and Skinwalker Mordian took command, and I got that first turn. I seized the initiative. And kind of like in the first game, getting the initiative didn't give me many advantages in terms of being able to kill stuff. In fact, I couldn't see any of the Votann army. It was all very well deployed behind line of sight blocking terrain. But it did give me an advantage in terms of getting up the board quickly, being able to use my scout moves aggressively, and most importantly, something I had learned to love about going first is that it meant I could put my Deathstrike markers down straight away. I didn't have to wait too long to get them in the fight. For my turn 1, I drew Sabotage and Extend Battle Lines. Now, in my movement, I took my Chimera on the right flank, the Lone Wolf one, and I moved, and I moved it, and I scout moved it, and I advanced it, and I got it far enough forward so that it was hiding behind the ruin on the right flank. But it wasn't quite able to get onto the objective itself. So I wasn't going to control that next turn, but from the turns onward, I would have a nice OC intensive unit with the infantry, and of course the Chimera, able to sit on that objective. As for my scout mirrors in the middle, I actually moved them forward and then completely swung everything onto the left flank. So by the end of my turn 1, I actually had like 4 scout mirrors all dogpiling or ready to dogpile on the top left objective. And there's a very good reason for this. That was the one that was going to be around at the end of the game. And that was the one that was going to be worth 15 points. So I don't really care about the objective in the middle because it's going to disappear turn 4. And anything that goes in the middle is going to die. It doesn't matter which side does it, it's going to die. And the objective on the right-hand side, I've got 2 Vanquishers and a Demolisher ready to move over there. And if the Votann try and go on it, if you look at where it's positioned, they're going to have to go on it on the wrong side of the ruin so they can be exposed. So to me, I'm thinking it's all about that top left objective, and that's where I pretty much divert all of my resources. End of turn 1, I have successfully extended my battle lines, and I sabotage one of the ruins. It's the ruin that's in the top left. Now, obviously, I have to wait a turn for it to come around, but just jumping ahead a little bit, my opponent doesn't stop my sabotage, so I am able to get the points for that. And that's a nice 8 secondary points in the bank straight away by battle round 1. But the last thing to mention before we go over to the Votann is I take all 3 of my Deathstrike markers and I put them in a position on the Votann's left flank. And I measure it out carefully. And what I do is I put the Hecaton up there in a really, really terrible position. Because if it wants to go left to go after the what we now know to be very important objective, then no matter how far it moves, unless it like advances, even then it's not guaranteed, it won't be able to get out of the 6-inch blast zone of the 3 Deathstrikes. If it goes forward, it won't be able to get out of the 6-inch blast zone of the Deathstrikes. In fact, the only place it can go is essentially into the back right-hand corner of its deployment zone if it wants to get out of the 6-inch blast zone. And if it does that, then I've got 2 Vanquishers which are covering that middle firing arc, and I've got a 3rd Vanquisher which can happily trundle round the corner and also get line of sight on it. That would mean I would have 3 Vanquishers on 1 Hecaton. It's highly unlikely it would actually get cover because of how... Oh no, it would get cover because there's a bit of cover in the middle of the board that if you shoot across it, you get cover from it. So it would get cover, to be fair. But it would be 3 Vanquishers, all in range, all with the Vanquish cannons, 2 of which would be hitting on 2s because of heavy and take aim stacking. So it puts that Hecaton in a really, really bad position because either it has to eat the nukes or it has to eat the Vanquishers. So with my trap set up, we go into Votann turn number 1. And my opponent remarks straight away, he's like, those Deathstrikes are really annoying for like controlling where I can go. And I said to him, mate, I thought they were a meme unit, but I'm actually quite enjoying them. And then he points out to me, you know what's really screwing me with them? The fact that I'm quite a slow army. And it never even occurred to me the potential that Deathstrikes would have into Votann. But Jack pointed out that Votann are quite a slow army. So most of their foot units can't get out of the blast zone, and their vehicles being quite chunky also struggle to get out of the blast zone. So Deathstrikes are actually weirdly effective into Votann because you can control their somewhat limited movement. And unlike most armies, they're actually going to probably get hit by one if you want to. So with the Deathstrikes doing a bit of a mind job on my opponent, Jack goes into his turn and he draws Overwhelming Force and Sabotage. What's interesting though is, sure, he can get Sabotage, no problem, but Overwhelming Force is only 1 target for it. It's one of my Chimeras that's on the top left-hand objective, and it doesn't have a grudge token on it. And the only units that can draw a line of sight to it will be 1 Sagittar and Hecaton, the one that's being potentially nuked, if he brings it over that left-hand flank. After much umming and ahhing, after much consideration, the Votann decide to see if they can just eat the nuclear missiles. And the Sagittar on the left and the Hecaton on the left both come over and they fire everything they have into that Chimera. But I pop smoke. And so we've got Votann, which are hitting on 4s, going down to hitting on 5s. And despite a great effort by the Votann, they don't destroy that Chimera. Many of the shots just go wild, and I think it's left alive on 1 wound. It just about survives the ordeal, but it does survive it. Now that Chimera surviving is actually a really big deal, because it means going into my turn, I'm able to pass my Battle Shock test, and that gets me 5 victory points. And this was really starting to put the pressure onto the Votann right from turn number 1. Because I'm on 1 of the objectives, I'm going to move into a position where I'm on 2 of the objectives this turn, and the Votann are not going to get any primary in their turn 2 because they're not on any of them because they're quite a slow army. And I've set my deployment up so if the Votann go into the middle, there's tanks that are going to hit them. If the Votann go over to the right, there's tanks that are going to hit them. If the Votann go over to the left, there's tanks that are going to hit them. Other armies that have got more maneuverability would be able to avoid all of these firing lanes, but the Votann have kind of got to move out and just tank it. And they're tough, but are they that tough? Are they tough enough to take on all of the guard firepower? Now for my turn 2, I move forward on the left-hand flank with a unit of infantry because I want to throw grenades at the Sagittar, and I also move one of my Vanquishers, the one that was sort of hiding behind the back rear of my deployment zone, and I move that over to the left-hand flank as well because it can draw a line of sight to the Hecaton, which moved over to that left-hand flank. A lot of my other units, they don't really need to move. I've got them where I want them. Like I said, I don't mind if the Votann move out onto the objectives because I've positioned my units so that I get the counter punch. I'm going to get the first slap in one way or another. So my turn 2 really just consists of me doing behind enemy lines by deep striking a unit of Silence there. I am able to get that. And I also draw Bring It Down for one of my cards, for one of my secondaries. First thing that I do is I throw grenades into the Sagittar, and then I hit it with 3 Chimeras worth of firepower. I hit it with 3 Hunter Killers, all the Flamers, everything. And I just managed to bring it down. It takes every little las bolt I've got, takes every stuff around I've got, but thanks to the lethal hits on the Chimeras, a lot of the wounds done to the Sagittar are not done by the Flamers, but they're done by the chip damage, by the Heavy Stubbers and by the las guns, because it's only got like a 3+ save, this thing. Then we come over to the Vanquisher, which can draw line of sight to the Hecaton. And I fire all my guns into it, but I save my Vanquisher cannon till the end because I've kept firing it first and it's kind of been let me down every so often over the tournament. So I save it till the end and I roll the dice and I get the 6 for the auto wound. And it goes through. Now I don't roll super good on the damage, I roll a 2 on the damage. So I take 8 wounds off the Hecaton. This halves the amount of wounds that it's got. And then I have to make the decision. Do I fire the Deathstrikes? Now, statistically, me and my opponent worked out that 3 Deathstrikes do 8 wounds to a Hecaton. So I turn to Jack and go, how many wounds have I got left? And he goes, 8. And I go, statistically, Jack, 3 Deathstrikes do 8 wounds. And he's like, fuck off, Tim, don't do it. Don't do it. And I go, womp, womp, womp. DEFCON 1, launching, DEFCON 1. That doesn't make sense, I know. And I fire the first Deathstrike in, and I get an okay amount of hits. I get 7 hits. But what's interesting about the Deathstrike is it's not an indirect fire weapon. So you don't get the benefit of cover from it when it shoots you, unless you're wholly in the cover. And so, because it's not indirect fire, it's one shot, it's blast, it's got the plasma warhead special, but it's not indirect fire technically. That means that the Hecaton, even with void armor, was only on a 5+ save, because AP -4 with void armor stratagem, basically Arm of Contempt, goes down to AP 3, so it's on a 5+ save. And so the first Deathstrike goes in and takes 3 wounds off it. I get like 7 hits. The second Deathstrike goes in and I only get 6 shots. But I do manage to take another 2 wounds off the Hecaton. So there's 1 Deathstrike left and there's 3 wounds. I could possibly roll double 1 and not kill it. It could happen. But I go for it. I fire all 3 Deathstrikes. And I roll on the number of shots, 11. And in a cataclysmic, nuclear, apocalyptic fireball, the Hecaton is consumed by the wrath of the Emperor, and it is destroyed. And it takes all 3, but it's the biggest Deathstrike kill of the tournament, and I would probably bet the biggest Deathstrike kill in the history of 10th edition. And I have to say, that's possibly one of my favorite tournament moments of all time. And what's interesting is I had a good chat with Jack afterwards, and we're good mates, so you know we had a good convo about the whole thing. And he said those Deathstrikes killing the Hecaton, it really pissed me off because I just wasn't expecting it. It was such a curveball, and then it just completely bamboozled me. And I think this is an important point to note. The Deathstrikes in all 3 games didn't do an overwhelming amount of damage. But in all 3 games, they completely psychologically voodooed my opponent. Completely messed with their game plan because it's such a funny unit, and how you interact with it, how you try and avoid it is hard. It makes you do things you don't want to do. And if you try and tank it, as we saw Jack do, well, there's a chance that you tank it absolutely fine because they're so swingy. But there's a chance that you don't tank it, and instead they tank you. But okay, I think we've wanked the Deathstrikes off enough now. Let's get into that Votann turn 2. Over on the right flank, they take a Sagittor and they put it onto the objective. Now, the objective that they go for is the one that my Lone Wolf Chimera is sat on. The reason they do that, even though it's potentially quite sacrificial for that Sagittor, is because they've drawn Storm Hostile Objective, and Sagittors are OC3. They might not look like it being tiny little moon buggies, but they're OC3, and therefore they out-OC my OC2 Chimera, getting Storm Hostile Objective in the bank, and also getting Engage on all fronts as well. So that little Sagittor got 6 points in the bank, which is good. Elsewhere, there's a lot of umming and ahhing from the Votann. Like I said, they've kind of been thrown a curveball. They've been thrown for a loop. And the other Hecaton, which starts from the board, Jack moves it and then puts it back, moves it, puts it back. And eventually he's like, you know what? I'm going to play safe with it because I've lost one Hecaton. And if I go too ballsy with this one, you could hit me with 2 Vanquishers and a Demolisher. And I'm like, I absolutely could do that. We measure it out, we check it. He's like, yeah, so I'm just going to put it behind a ruin and just get it ready to stage for like turn 3. Speaking of Hecatons though, the one that was in reserve comes in and it basically goes in the exact same place as the one that just got nuked. He's pushing it onto that left flank because guess what? That's where the 15-point objective is going to be at the end of the game. Speaking of that left flank, the Votann really commit to it. And the Brokia Thunderkin come in the absolute top left-hand corner. I thought I'd screen them out and stop them. Turns out that I hadn't, and they do manage to squeeze in there. But the problem is that by just squeezing in, they've only got 18-inch range in their guns. So they're not actually very in range of anything. And so with the Votann movement done, we get into shooting, and the Brokia Thunderkin kill a Chimera, but they're only able to damage one of my Leman Russes. They damage a Vanquisher, and that's it. The Hecaton that had come in on that flank is able to kill one of the Chimeras that was over on the left as well. And this one actually had a grudge token on it, and so that meant that it was one of the grudge tokens that gets put on the beginning of the game, so there's a big CP boost for the Votann coming next turn, because they get like bonus 3 CP if they kill in the first couple of turns. We then have the unit of Berserkers go into an infantry squad, and they fail to kill it. It was one of the ones that have been forced to disembark from a destroyed Chimera. And then we have one of the Terminator units that goes in to a couple of Chimeras. Again, this is all happening on the left-hand flank, and they don't kill either Chimera. I get a little lucky on my saves. Jack gets a little unlucky on his attacks. And so as a result, the Berserkers have gone in. The Terminators have gone in. The Brokia Thunderkin have gone in. Not Sagittor, because that's dead. The Hecaton, the reserve Hecaton's gone in. And really the only thing to show for it is 2 dead Chimeras and a slightly injured infantry squad. Don't get me wrong, I've got another Chimera that's on 1 wound and another Chimera that's on 4 wounds. So they're not long for this world, and I've taken a bit of damage on Leman Russ, but that's a lot to commit for not removing a huge amount of assets. And with that, we swing over to guard turn 3. And I draw Established Locus, and I try and get it by putting my Commissar in the back corner of the deployment zone, the enemy deployment zone, but they do overwatch it and kill him. Fortunately, it turns out a Commissar cannot survive the overwatch from Hecaton, so he dies. But I also draw Cleanse, and I'm able to easily cleanse 2 objectives, the top left one and the bottom right one, because I've got an infantry squad in the Chimera on the bottom right that just jumps out and cleanses it, and I've got enough assets hanging around on the top left one to be able to cleanse that. What's really important though is not only do I get cleansed, but I also get another 5 victory points for primary. And the Votann, once again going into their turn 3, won't be getting any victory points for primary. They're really, really far behind. Now, Jack had tried pushing out a few units here and there to go for some primary points, but when it comes over to my turn, I decide I'm just going to clear up as many small assets as I can. I'm not going to go for the Hecatons, because what's going through my mind is I might be able to kill the Hecatons, but what's really important is to kill everything around them. Because if I can kill the Thunderkin, or if I can kill the Hearthkin that were in my phase, or the Berserkers, or I can kill the Hearth Guard, I just need to kill all these little bits. And so I do lots of split firing, and I do lots of bits of 1 bit of fire here, 1 bit of fire there, cheeky grenade here and there. But by the time the dust has settled, the left flank is essentially clear. The Brokir Thunderkin actually escaped somewhat unscathed. They might have taken a little bit of damage, but they escaped somewhat unscathed, which is bad because they are going to start coming in and doing damage to me. But the Berserkers are completely dead. All of the Terminators up there are completely dead as well. And there was some couple of units of Hearthkin that I've been pushing forward, and they're dead. Not Hearthkin, the little ones. Maybe they're Hearthkin or Hearthgod, I can't remember. The basic battle line Dwarf unit, okay? Both of those are dead. And so we go into Dwarf turn 3. We go into Votann turn 3. And yes, they still have 2 Hackathons left over. But outside of 2 Hackathons, we've got a unit of Termies, a couple of units of Bikes, and a somewhat injured unit of Brokir Thunderkin. So the Dwarves have a big turn. The Votann have a big turn 3. And they go in with everything they can to do as much damage as possible. And they are able to clear out a couple of infantry squads, and they are able to kill one of my tank commanders and one of my vanquishers, both that were on the left flank. But when they kill my tank commander, it fires back. And I fire back into the Brokir Thunderkin, and I nearly wipe them out. I get really good with the Demolisher Cannon. Everything goes in. And so that unit, even though it's, you know, there's like 2 of them left, and there's 2 of them left and the Sergeant, but they're almost combat ineffective there. And so we get to so that's the end of the Votann turn 3. They go for their big hit, their big slap, and they do okay. They take out a couple of tanks, and they take out a couple of infantry squads. And unfortunately, just as we're about to go into battle round 4, what very well may be a deciding battle round, we run out of time. And it's a real shame because the game was so much fun and I would have loved to have seen it go to its natural conclusion, but it was a hard dice down. It was the end of round 3. And so we get to the end of the game on round 3. And to give you an idea of what's left over in both armies, I fired all 3 of my Deathstrikes. They're all alive, but I fired all 3 of my Deathstrikes. I've got 2 Vanquishers and a tank commander left over. And I've also got 3 Chimeras left, although 2 of them are badly injured, and I've got 3 infantry squads. And the Votann, and bear in mind it's about to go into my shooting phase. The Votann, I've got a very badly injured unit of Brokir Thunderkin, 2 Hackathons, and 2 units of Bikes, and 1 of the Terminator squads. So both sides were fairly battered. We were doing pretty equals damage to each other. I would have loved to have seen what I could have done in turn 4, because my plan turn 4 was not to even go near the Hackathons, man. My plan was to essentially kill the Bikers, which were both on the left flank, because I've got 2 Vanquishers over there that could see them, and to finish off the Thunderkin and essentially clear the left flank, so to the point where the only thing that would have been left on it was 1 Hackathon. And I was going to give up the right flank where there was another Hackathon and there was a Sagittar and there was a unit of Terminators, because that right flank was only going to be, in terms of primary points, was only going to be worth at max like 8 to the Votann, because it was going to disappear at the beginning of turn 5 and they would have only had the chance to score points on it on turn 4. And that's even if they had been able to score points there, because I did have an infantry squad over there that could have jumped onto that objective and maybe denied it for them, and then they spend their turn 4 killing the infantry squad, but they don't get any primary and they're completely out of position. So my kind of plan was to basically completely give up on the middle objective, completely give up on the right objective, basically take everything I have and just dogpile it onto the left flank, clear everything but the Hackathon turn 4, take the punch from the Hackathon turn 4, and then hopefully clear it turn 5. But likewise, that's if everything goes perfectly to plan for me. Who knows what the Votann could have done? Maybe they could have cleared that right flank really easily, turn 4, and then come over, got some primary points, started doing some moving, some charging. I mean, Hackathons are very, very powerful. They could be doing a lot of damage. Who knows how it would have gone? But in the end, we had to call it at turn 3. And the final score was 41 points to the Guard and 26 points to the Votann. In terms of score breakdown, the Votann hadn't managed to get any primary points, but they had managed to get 16 points on secondaries. And for the Guard, we'd managed to get 10 points on primary. And we were going to turn 4. We were going to get 8 points on that top left objective. And then on the secondaries, we'd managed to pick up 21 points there as well. So we were ahead on points. The big question is, could we have maintained that lead? And it would have really depended on how my firepower would have gone. But at the end of the day, that did end up being, even if it was a bit of a premature one, it did end up being a victory for the Guard. And I want to say a very, very, very well played game, a very good game to Jack and the Votann. Interesting side note, but Jack and I have noticed that when we play each other, the games do tend to use most of the time in the first 3 turns, and if we're lucky, we're able to get sort of turn 4. But it's not uncommon, if you go back and look at the games that we've played, for our games to unfortunately, not really make it to turn 4, turn 5. So we both agreed at the end of that game, because we don't want this to keep happening, we both agreed that we're going to use a chess clock if we get paired into each other in tournaments going forward. And we've talked to the TO Isaac, and he said yes, we have chess clocks on hand, so we can borrow one from the venue, and hopefully that way we can avoid the situation where games ending prematurely, and we can make sure that we're getting to turn 5. We can make sure we get those results, because I know that both Jack and I were disappointed that this game did end a little bit early. But with all of that said, we get to the end of game 3. We get to the end of the tournament. And I don't mean to alarm you, gentlemen, but I have managed to go 3 wins in a row using 3 Deathstrikes. 1 victory per Deathstrike missile. And I ended up placing 2nd overall because there was another player that won all 3 of their games, and they did score more points than me. So they got the first. But hey, I'll take it. Getting on the podium with triple Deathstrike, that's one to put on the CV. But memeing aside, I went into this whole thing thinking I was going to go 0-3. I thought the Deathstrikes were going to be a huge hindrance. And actually, I have to say that they are an incredibly fun unit to use. I'd love to use triple Deathstrike again. I'd love to use them on Battle Report versus Simon and see how salty he gets against them. But on a serious note, they are a very interesting unit. And the fact that they're only damage 1 does feel a bit wimpy. But the fact they're like AP3 or AP4, something insane, is really good. Having pseudo indirect fire that's AP4 is great. If I could change one thing about them, I would prefer if they were like D6 plus 3 shots and then damage 2. I think that would be better. The 2d6 is so swingy. It's a real pain in the ass, to be honest. But in a funny sort of way, it does kind of add to the charm of the unit, and it does kind of add to the excitement of the unit. And what I noticed with Deathstrike, what they reminded me of was using Vanquishers. Vanquishers are a unit which a lot of people lambast and look down on, and I did for a long time as well, because they're like one shot. But you don't look at the one shot, you look at the potential of that unit. And the potential is that a Vanquisher can put a shot through the front of an enemy vehicle and out the other side. They can do a horrendous amount of damage if your opponent fails that inevitable 4 invulnerable save. And that forces your opponent to be cagey and to worry about it. And that's what was happening in that 3rd game. Like, the reason the Hecatons didn't come barreling down is basically my Vanquishers didn't fire many shots, but they controlled the game massively. And the Deathstrikes are very similar. Sure, they might only do 2 damage. They might do nothing. But they could hit your opponent with 12 shots, hitting on 2s, strength 16, AP -4, and they could absolutely wipe a unit out. They could tear a chunk out of the opponent. And it's not that one is really a threat. I think if you only bring 1 of them, no one's going to give a shit. But if you bring 3 of them and stack all 3 of them in one place, then your opponent does have to give them the respect. Not the respect they necessarily deserve, but they have to begrudgingly give the Deathstrikes the respect. And so I would say, looking back on this now, Deathstrikes are genuinely a viable unit. Crazy as it sounds, they're genuinely a viable unit. But you need 3 of them, because you can just ignore 1. And you need to use them like you use your vanquishers, to force your opponent into dilemmas. And there's a big difference between a dilemma and a problem, because problems have solutions, but dilemmas have no good outcome. And that is what the Deathstrike does. If I put all 3 on your home objective, that's a dilemma for my opponent. Because either they stay on that objective with something that is sufficiently durable to take 3 Deathstrikes, at which point I just might not launch them. I don't have to fire them. At which point my opponent may have put a very expensive valuable unit to hold a home objective, which isn't pushing into my face. Or they abandon the home objective, which could cost them primary points. Either way, your opponent is not getting the ideal solution from that situation. But of course, all of this is just like my opinion, man. Let me know what you think down in the comments section below. Are you still a firm believer in that Deathstrikes are a complete meme unit, or do they have potential? Are you going to become a child of Atom and worship the big bomb? If you enjoyed today's video, don't forget to smash that like button and also subscribe to never miss an episode. Would you like to know more? If so, then please consider becoming a channel member or patron. By supporting the channel, not only will you be doing your part, but you'll also be helping me create more content for your viewing pleasure and unlocking a whole host of perks. You get everything from a badge next to your name, custom emojis, but the big one is access to the Mordian Glory Discord server, an online community with almost 2,500 active members. It's always popping off in the MG Discord. We've got channels for army lists, hobbying, tactics, stories, and even a pretty spicy meme section as well. For all you greenhorns that wanted to see the Mordian glory hole, today is your lucky day. And joking aside, I do want to say a massive thank you to all of the current channel members and patrons. You guys are amazing. Truly the lifeblood of the channel. I could not do Mordian Glory full time without the incredible and generous support of my members. So thank you guys so much. And last but certainly not least, I want to say a personal thank you to all of my top tier Patreons. These are the War Masters, the people who have truly gone above and beyond the call of duty. So a heartfelt thank you to Alex Dengal, Bonbon Vert, Lord Pryor, Mark Panconi, RJ Scorpion, Swordfish Trombone, Try Again Bragg, John Stubbs, Nick Walsh, Diesel Fox, and August Barney. Seriously guys, thank you from the bottom of my heart. Your support is incredible and it makes a huge difference. Thank you so much. That's all for now. Hope you've all enjoyed today's video, and of course, as always, see you guys next time.